really delighted to be chairing this panel on understanding the past. On this panel we'll begin with Professor Tolly Bradford from Concordia University of Edmonton, followed by Dr. Chelsea Horton here at the University of Victoria, and Professor Heidi Stark, also at the University of Victoria. We'll be sticking to a fairly strict 15-minute speaking time, and then we'll be opening it up for questions. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Tolly Bradford.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I added a little bit of an introduction to my piece because I thought it would be important to sort of speak to my positionality as a historian. Historians have a complicated relationship with colonialism, and I'm aware of that as a historian. So I wanted to give you my sort of personal history and how I came to my own research and what I'm doing with my research. So I was raised in an Anglican community in Ottawa, at the center of the nation, as it were. But as a young person, I was very interested in religion as a concept. Didn't really understand it all, but I was interested in it. When I went to my undergrad, I became very interested in not Canadian history, but in African history, and particularly in the story that I was told at one lecture about how African nationalism in the 1960s was led, for the most part, by Christian African leaders. That is, African leaders who had been educated in Christian schools, and that was part of what allowed them to be the political leaders that they became in the 1960s. So I was really captivated by this, what I saw as a paradox of colonialism being defeated, in a sense, by people who were brought up in colonial institutions. And so my master's work was on that aspect in South Africa, particularly. But then I became a teacher and worked at a Dene school in northern Saskatchewan. And I was immediately struck by the Catholicism of the community. It was deeply Catholic in all sorts of ways. Spoke Dene, that was the main language, but also incredibly Catholic. And so obviously I reflected on my understanding of African history and what I was seeing there in Saskatchewan and said, well, here is a really interesting project. Let's look at the comparisons, and is the story the same in Africa and Canada? And so that led me to my PhD research, in which I compared Indigenous missionaries in Canada and South Africa in the 19th century, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. Since that time, I've become more interested in not so much the Indigenous Christian experience, although that's still ongoing, but I'm interested in the colonial mentality, that is, the mentality of the colonizer, because I think, in fact, we settler historians need to know a lot more about that, as well as about the Indigenous experience. So today's talk kind of brings together those two interests, that is the Indigenous Christian sort of experience and my new interest, I guess, in sort of the mentality of the colonizer and the place of Christianity particularly in this story. So what I'm going to do is talk about two patterns that I see in this history, very, very briefly. The first common pattern that we see in the history of Christianity in sort of encounter in Canada is that despite the time period, despite the power structure that exists between Indigenous people and Euro-Canadians, what we see is that Christianity was always shaped by what I would call a supremacist characteristic. That is, this supremacist characteristic guided the way that Christianity was used by Euro-Canadians in their interactions with non-Christians, principally Indigenous people. Obviously, this is most obvious in residential schools, in which Christianity becomes the truth that the students were forced to accept. But what I want to show you is that this supremacist characteristic was actually also present in much more seemingly benign ways, and I think that's what I want to highlight. So while residential schools gives us an obvious example of this, what I want to look at is the writings of a little-known fur trader named George Nelson, who worked for the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company between 1803 and 1823. George Nelson was a middle manager. He's not important in the fur trade per se, but he does keep an amazing journal. And in his journal, he tells us in rich detail about the Indigenous communities that he interacts with, particularly the Ojibwe and the Cree of what is now northern Manitoba and northern Saskatchewan. He witnesses their spiritual practices. He learns about what he calls their Cree myths or their Ojibwe myths, and he describes certain ceremonies and what he calls conjuring practices, as well as describing the general life ways and the spirit life ways of the people. And he emphasizes the importance of dreaming, the spirit guardians, and dreams as dream quests as an incredibly important part holding this whole sort of system together. Now, this journal, again, written in 18 teens and 1820s, is really interesting. Editors of the journal are struck by what they call Nelson's willingness to listen seriously and with a relatively open mind to what his Ojibwe and Cree associates tell him. Moreover, note these same modern-day observers, Nelson, quite in contrast to other Europeans at the time, and especially in contrast to those that were to open residential schools, displayed in his writing a notable sympathy towards the customs and the practices that he witnessed and wrote about, portraying these various conjuring practices not as ignorant superstition, but as, quote, dramatic and even humorous means of communicating with and manipulating a harsh physical and spiritual environment. That is to say, in marked contrast to most Europeans at the time, Nelson seemed to see a logic and a truthfulness in the practices that he wrote about. However, even in his openness to and desire to understand these indigenous life ways, and even despite his own kinship connections to several indigenous communities in the Northwest, he was also blinded by at least one major issue in his writing, and that is his own deep faith in Christianity and in the supremacy of that spiritual framework. Thus, his journals are threaded through with a distinct and mostly unresolved tension, which on the one hand celebrate and value the truthfulness of the conjuring that he sees, and on the other hand denigrate these practices as antithetical to what he felt was the right, Christian, way to communicate with the spiritual forces of the world. Indeed, in reading his journal, you get the sense that while he wanted to fully accept the sacredness of the practices that he witnessed, his own Christianity would not allow him to do it. At points, he tries to address this tension in a way that would satisfy his sense of Christian supremacy. In one passage, for instance, he suggests that the most virtuous elements of the indigenous culture and spiritual practices that he witnessed are evidence that all people, even these apparently non-Christian people, carry Christian knowledge in their heart. That is to say, he intimated that Christianity was so supreme that it sits inside the hearts and minds of all people, being performed and used even without the knowledge of the individual. At other times, he simply dismisses the full integrity of the indigenous spiritual and moral worldview, saying that while he agreed with many elements of the life ways that he witnessed, they lacked what he would have called the moral value that came with Christianity, and thus were inferior and incomplete. In much of his writing, this tension remains unresolved. For Nelson, like the missionary staff at the residential school, only Christianity seemed to offer a truly sacred explanation of the world. Now, the difference between Nelson and those residential school staff, of course, is the power. Nelson does not have the power nor the interest in trying to convert the people he's writing about. He's a fur trader, after all. He wants business. He doesn't want to upset people. So that's one theme that I wanted to put out there. The second dominant theme that I see in the history of Christianity and encounter in Canada is related to this first one. While there was certainly a great deal of outright resistance to Christianity on the part of Indigenous peoples and communities, and even more often simply passive resistance displayed through ignoring Christian messages, or in this residential school case, running away from residential schools, it is also the case that by the late 19th century, and even earlier in what is now Eastern Canada, many Indigenous peoples west of the Great Lakes had either fully converted or had as was more often the case, affiliated themselves with some elements or aspects of Christianity. This conversion, or to use my preferred word, affiliation, that developed between Indigenous peoples and Christianity can be placed on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum were those individuals who, following the pattern of the rest of their band or their kin group, practiced what I would call limited or highly selective involvement with Christianity. Ultimately, this meant taking or incorporating aspects of Christianity and placing them within an Indigenous framework. We find critical but revealing remarks about this sort of affiliation throughout the writings of missionaries. For example, traveling in what is now southern Alberta in the mid-1800s, one Methodist missionary writes about meeting a Kainai man who showed the missionary his sacred bundle. According to the missionary, the bundle included, among other things, what the missionary wrote as Catholic relics, which we must assume were a crucifix, a copy of a French catechism, and one entire issue of the Wesleyan Missionary Notices, a newsletter published by the Missionary Society in Toronto and shipped to the West through its missionary contacts. Now, while the missionary bluntly remarked that he thought Catholic and Methodist materials made strange company inside this Kainai medicine bag, we must assume that for this Kainai man, these relics and these texts held some significant sacred power that would help him protect himself and achieve balance in his own world. Moreover, it may have been the case that he needed to include these symbols because of a communication that he might have had through a dream. So in fact, he may have been following the dream in order to acquire these items. And while this Kainai man does not convert to Christianity and never probably would, he seemed to be accessing an affiliation with a perceived spiritual power, those perhaps supposedly supremacist characteristics that were associated with Christianity. Now, at the other end of the spectrum from this Kainai man were those individuals, indigenous individuals, who seemed to fully adhere to the messages and the lifestyle promoted by the Christian churches. In the 19th century, the best documented examples of these are indigenous converts who become missionaries themselves, that is, indigenous ordained ministers. Henry Budd, a missionary that I've written about a lot, is a Muskego Cree, born in the Hudson's Bay coast in the early 1800s, and he was the first ordained indigenous man in Western Canada. He's ordained in 1850 and spends the next 25 years of his life working as a minister, as a missionary in northern Saskatchewan and what is now northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, amongst the woodland Cree of Cumberland House and the Saskatchewan River area. While we should, and perhaps in the question period we can, debate the reasons that someone like Budd grew to hold such an attachment to the missionary ethos, what we know is that from Henry Budd's own voluminous writings, he wrote about 1,000 words of handwritten journals and letters, we get a clear sense of how he saw his own self and how he managed to reconcile his Christian identity with his position as Indigenous man. In one telling passage, he wrote, Budd reflects very openly on this contradictory position. He says, I am, he says, placed in very special circumstances where I can glorify God by preaching the gospel of his dear Son because I possess the native language and therefore am more able to address the natives with ease. Acquainted with their habits and superstitions, I can enter into all their feelings, answer all their objections, and I see this as a great talent that I have to occupy until my Lord's coming. There's clearly no problem in us identifying him as deeply Christian in his own sense of himself, and also committed to using his indigeneity to expand Christianity into Indigenous communities. Now, when I was doing research as a historical consultant for the TRC, I saw versions of this same pattern again and again. That is to say, as I watched and read testimony from survivors telling their sometimes horrific, sometimes painful, sometimes humorous stories of life at schools, we see these sorts of statements coming again and again of references to Christian faith and Christianity. Now, I have two examples. I'm just going to skip to the second because my time is running out. In one example collected at Baker Lake, an Inuit survivor speaks about the ongoing healing that he and his community are doing and how it requires what he says is the coupling of Inuit wisdom and Bible-based teachings. He says that these spiritual tools help us in the way that secular counseling of psychology and psychiatry, which are used to sedate us, do not help us. While these sorts of comments promoted the inclusion of promoting both the inclusion of Inuit knowledge and Christian spirituality are part of a healing process, they are not unanimous, although they are certainly prevalent in the TRC hearings if you spend a lot of time looking and reading them. So what I hope to have done in this historical sketch is two things. At one point, emphasizing the complexity and the contradictory nature of the history of Christianity and its colonial interactions with Indigenous people in Canada. And I was thinking of John Burroughs' statement last night about nuance is sacred, and I think to some degree I want you to see the nuance here and recognize the nuance. The other thing I want to sort of suggest is that there might be an applied lesson here about the place of Christianity in formal and informal work of reconciliation. While a case can certainly be made, and has been made by some scholars, that Christian churches should not be involved in reconciliation, I would counter that Christianity, even the churches, cannot help but be involved. Whether they want it or not, whether it seems historically justified or not, Christianity is part of the lives of many Indigenous communities, and it is also a coherent element, although a problematic one, that has and continues to animate the relationship between settlers and Indigenous peoples in Canada. If reconciliation is in part about relationships between settlers and Indigenous Canadians, the problematic role of Christianity in that past relationship, and maybe in the future, must be carefully considered.
Thank you, Tully. Now, Dr. Chelsea Horton.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Like, eat the microphone, apparently. It is such and truly and deeply my honor to be here with you all today in this beautiful space, this hall of woven cedar, to sit with together such a fundamental, if truly fuzzy, matter. I really want to thank the organizers for convening this critical discussion, and in the same way that we started this morning, really want to acknowledge the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory we're gathered, and we're gathered every time that we're here at UVic, and the Esquimalt and Songhees and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I myself was raised in Tsleil-Waututh territory over in the Lower Mainland, and I now reside in Snanawas territory up island, about 2 hours from here. My family were settlers of Greater British stock, kind of a Greater British hybrid, and we've lived on this coast for 4 generations, including my sister's little ones. We also have colonial roots that stretch back across Turtle Island to the Atlantic, and that really loaded colonial vessel, the Mayflower. So I share both literal and figurative kinship with centuries of colonial practice and policy, and I carry a strong sense of responsibility and relationship to that living history. So today what I want to do with you is reflect through a somewhat personal lens on several interconnected sites of my work as a historian. My own family has an uneasy relationship with religion, so it surprised both them and me when, as a university student, I became tremendously fascinated and pulled to religion as a space and a site of both colonial and intercultural interaction. And this research interest flourished, and it's one of 3 sites that I want to share some reflection with you from today. The second is the history classroom, and the third, the broader discipline of history itself. In the lead up to this event, there were 3 words that kept coming to me unbidden: heart, hope, and humility. And so it's in that spirit that I want to share some stories and some observations. As Tali's just shared, and as many more Canadians are alive to in the wake of the work of the TRC, Christianity has played an intimate roles in fact, to be more precise, in colonialism in this place that we now know as Canada. These roles are complex, and they're historically specific. It's important that we acknowledge and we examine Christianity's particular imbrication in colonialism in particular places at particular times. At the same time, it's important to make space for and to seek out Indigenous articulations and applications of this faith, and beyond a strictly instrumental framework of either political or economic strategy. The religious studies scholar Michael McNally, I think, has put this really eloquently when he says that Indigenous Christianity has frequently been a process of making meaning, not just making do. My own research is focused not on Christianity, but rather on Indigenous interactions with another lesser-known religion, the Bahá'í faith. And I need to say here how profoundly humbled I am to be sharing these reflections in this particular space, at this particular event. I come to the study of Indigenous Baha'i history as somebody who is both non-Indigenous and non-Baha'i. And so I offer these reflections from that space and in a spirit of respect and dialogue. The numbers are slippery, but it's said that some 7,000 Indigenous people joined the Baha'i religion in Canada and the United States during the second half of the 20th century. The Baha'i faith is a religion of mid-19th century origin, began in the region of Iran. There were several small pockets of geographic concentration that developed among Indigenous Baha'is in the Capel Valley in Saskatchewan in the 1960s, up in the Yukon in the Whitehorse area, in Dineta on the Navajo Reservation down in the United States. But by and large, the community was and really remains composed of individuals and family groups spread over a wide geography, both urban and reserve, and yet connected by a clear sense of Indigenous religious community, as well as an explicitly global spiritual geography. Among the Indigenous people who became active and sustained Baha'is, many nurtured a really strong, if a quiet, activist orientation to their religion, which they've applied in fields such as Indigenous education, health, arts, law, cultural revitalization, and what we would now call reconciliation. And I want to share just one specific snapshot that I think is especially germane to our discussion here today. In the late 1960s, Indigenous Baha'is composed roughly a quarter of the Canadian Baha'i population, and Indigenous matters were really prominent on the community's national agenda. In a December 1968 submission to the Canadian Conference on Human Rights, the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Canada, which is the national Baha'i administrative body, spoke about a brief called The Right to an Identity, which the community had just submitted to the federal government. This submission states, and I'm quoting here, "As you will note, the brief concerns itself particularly with the situation of Canada's Indian and Eskimo population. It is the contention of the Baha'i community that the most serious disability under which these original Canadians today suffer is the deprivation of the sense of their unique spiritual worth. Identity arises not merely from individual heredity, but from the consciousness of a history, a culture, and a body of spiritual values. It is precisely these latter elements which have been consistently suppressed and distorted during the past 3 centuries of Indian-white encounter. Until this condition is corrected, the Native Canadian will continue to be the victim, and the European Canadian the responsible party, in a spiritual injustice whose effects may be seen in every other area of life." A color pamphlet was produced to spread this message more broadly, and this message really, a forthright assessment, I would say, was reiterated in that brief. The brief states that identity is stolen when the conditions necessary for individual development and self-respect are destroyed not by circumstance, but as the result of a deliberate policy on the part of stronger societies and institutions. It has been stolen from 500,000 Canadian citizens. The cause of this vast social tragedy is not nature, but a spiritual injustice, the systematic destruction of the Indian sense of his own identity. Through the early months of 1969, a team of prominent Indigenous Baha'is presented this pamphlet at public events across the country in both Indigenous and in settler communities. And these Baha'is included Thomas Anaquad, who at that time was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly, he was Saulteaux from Saskatchewan, Dorothy Francis, who was also Saulteaux from the prairies, John Thomas, Ditidad from here on the west coast, Nidra Greenaway, a woman of both Métis and Chinese heritage, and Model Mudd, who had Cherokee roots. Both this brief and this accompanying pamphlet, as I suggested, were in some ways exceptional among Baha'i outreach initiatives. For one, the tone is much more frank than most Baha'i messaging, and this is informed, no doubt, by the particular tenor of the time. This was a so-called Red Power era, and this campaign was carried out only a few months before the Trudeau senior government released what's now infamously known as the White Paper, which called, without deep consultation with Indigenous communities, for an end to the Indian Act, an end to treaties, an end to so-called special status. And this was something that really galvanized a lot of Indigenous opposition in the country and led to the formation of organizations like the Union of BC Indian Chiefs that remain so strong and prominent in this province today. In an extension of this frank approach, this Right to an Identity campaign was also rather explicit, in relative terms anyway, in terms of presenting or advancing the Baha'i faith, as well as a specific Baha'i prophecy concerning the Indigenous peoples of the Americas as an answer to the apathy and the spiritual malaise said to be afflicting Indigenous peoples, and indeed all Canadians. Forbidden from proselytizing, Baha'is typically took a more muted approach to religious teaching that involves service and living the life. In a context of ongoing missionary competition in residential schools, though, any effort to present any new iteration of religious truth, subtle or not, were perhaps not surprisingly also contested by some. So to echo Tolly, then, religion has been a tremendously rich, layered, and loaded nexus of exchange in colonial Canada. And we see in this specific historical snapshot an express articulation of the relationship between Indigenous and settler peoples and colonial injustice as fundamentally spiritual in nature. Relationship was something that was forged on the ground in the context of Indigenous Baha'i interactions as well. In interviews with me, Indigenous Baha'is invariably spoke with great warmth about non-Indigenous Baha'is who had committed themselves to the work of relationship building over the long term, to the work of what Siksika Baha'i Alison Healy called genuine love. And it's here, from this space of heart connection, that I want to pivot from the historical Baha'i context to the context of the classroom by way of a bit of field experience and to sound a note of hope. For the past several years, I've been working primarily with and for First Nations here in BC on claims and consultation-related research. And through this work and the relationships that it has sparked, I am consistently humbled and moved by elders and other community members who, in the face of very real structural and symbolic violence, continue to live by teachings of love and laughter. This semester, I'm back in the classroom for the first time in 4 years in a teaching role, and here too I have been humbled and moved by the heart and the understanding of my students. And admittedly, they're a highly self-selecting crew. It's a third-year course researching Indigenous rights, title, and reconciliation. They all want to be there for some reason, and they aren't necessarily representative of the student body at large. But nevertheless, sea change is the word that I keep landing on to sort of characterize this shift in awareness and discourse that is underway. And it's really evident to me that the work of the TRC, as well as the fine work of other instructors here at UVic, has played a really important role in this. A good number of my students are aspiring teachers themselves, and they intend to take the passion and perspective that they have to bear in elementary schools and in high schools, and in that way help dislodge some of the paralysis that currently seems to be vexing a lot of settler teachers who want so very badly to help educate their students on the history of colonialism, to help indigenize the curriculum, but they don't know how to do it, and they end up doing nothing at all. I see in my students, most of whom are history majors of settler heritage, an interest and a commitment to track the fine-grained workings and implications of colonial policy and practice, and I see at the same time a hunger and an openness to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing and being, to be in relationship with Indigenous people and particular place. In a course focused on rights and title, the so-called Indian land question, as it was called here in BC in the 19th century, has not surprisingly been at the core of our discussions. My own recent experiences, though, those in the classroom, those in community, are pushing me to reframe the land question as the relationship question. This formulation, as we heard last night, takes in not only relationships between human beings, but relationships with the non-human world, with land, with water, with particular place. As a settler historian, it isn't necessarily my role or my place to teach and engage all facets of this relationship. My role is contextual and it's contingent on my own webs of relationship. But it's my responsibility to foster this framework, to create space for Indigenous knowledge, knowledge holders, Indigenous law, and also to help alert students to the limits of knowing as well, that not all knowledge is for all to know. I can tell you that talk like this makes some historians squirm, but I don't share the same investment in disciplinary boundary maintenance that seems, consciously or otherwise, to prompt that kind of discomfort. Absolutely, there is and there will remain a need for rigorous historical analysis that's based on documentary evidence that tracks change over time, some of the hallmarks of the historical discipline. And rights research is, in fact, one example of that in a field that I myself am engaged in. But there, too, there's space and a need to complicate this. John Burroughs has recently shared a beautiful piece in the Canadian Historical Review that really calls historians to engage with the hard work of unpacking how and why historians' work has been deployed in defense of a really rigid and originalist idea of history that's been advanced by the courts. Residential school research is another place in terms of that need for detailed documentary analysis. The TRC has conducted vital work that has helped raise awareness of the living colonial history of this country, really to new levels. But the historical research that was conducted under its mandate was essentially marshaled into a structure that was predetermined by the litigation that gave rise to the commission. So we need to do that detailed archival work and analysis to understand how the residential school system, as well as interconnected institutions like industrial schools and Indian hospitals, functioned again in particular places at particular times. But we need to do all this, and here I'm going to bring things to a close, and the final H in my title trio, with great humility, with explicit recognition of the contours and the limits of our methods, and an allied commitment to build relationship and create space, again, for Indigenous knowledge, people, and perspectives. That particular brief Bahá'í snapshot that I shared, I think, offers a window on historical relationship building as well, and a spiritual critique of colonialism twinned at the same time with a message of new religious vision. Again, as Tali has suggested, the past is replete with complexity and contradiction, and I see real value and a need to seek out and to sit with historical spaces and moments of spiritual heart connection, as well as oppression. And again, to echo Tali and John Burroughs from last night, that notion that nuance is sacred. So then, in humility and with heart, I do have hope. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chelsea. And now Professor Heidi Stark. And keep it close.
Really close.
Pretty close. Can you guys
For
hear
the
me?
benefit of our...
Clay? No? Clay, can you hear me now? No.
You have to be right.
I'll just use my theater voice.
Very good.
Bonjour and Dinaway Maganuduk, Kuwait ni Benesi Kindigo, Bijou and Do Dame, Mikanakwa Juing Nindun Chaba, Sagabaso Kwe, Gaye Mede Kwe Nindao. I too want to echo acknowledgements of the Lekwungen speaking peoples on whose lands we're on, and the Wasanich, Esquimalt, and Songhees, who have taught me so much both in and out of the classroom and have really helped me to think differently about a treaty, which as someone coming from a treaty nation, it's been just such a great learning opportunity to be in a place and work with people and learn from people who use such a different language to talk about relationship. And so I'm just really grateful for that. So I said in Anishinaabemowin that I'm, what did I say? My name is Heidi, and I'm a Lynx Clan, and I'm from Turtle Mountain, which is in North Dakota, just south of the border. So today I want to just talk briefly about why it is or how I think about the kind of language we as Anishinaabe use when we talk about our treaties as sacred. And then kind of close with some reflections in some of the work I've been doing with John Burroughs and teaching some of the law camps and working with Sagamay First Nation around their governance about how that might animate Indigenous law today. So when I was a graduate student, I was really obsessed with concepts like sovereignty, and nationhood, and largely because it was a language that many of our leaders were speaking to resist the continued encroachment of their political authority over their lands. And I had kind of come of age, if you will, or started college during this major Supreme Court case in Minnesota, known as Minnesota v. Mille Lacs, where the Ojibwe had taken their treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather in what gets referred to as their ceded territories, all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that they had the right to both hunt, fish, and gather off the reserve, but also to regulate how they did that. And this was following an earlier set of cases out of Wisconsin that had led to major protests on boat landings. It was much like the fishing wars in Washington state in the 80s in Wisconsin and 90s. There was lots of tension around fishing, primarily over spearfishing. So I was really interested in thinking about treaties because I'd watched so many leaders kind of fight for a recognition of our treaty rights. But at the same time, I had also watched them kind of animate our own legal traditions in the process. And so at the same time that they were seeking like some of the most qualified expert witnesses and some of the like best strategic attorneys to make their case in the court, they had also called on numerous spiritual leaders to guide them through what it would mean to bring forward both the voices of their ancestors who had shaped those treaties and secured them those rights, but also those animals, spirits, plants, and so on, who they were speaking for now through these court cases. And so at the same time that they were, again, writing briefs, they had sent runners out from the Great Lakes to Washington, D.C., following older traditions about how messages get brought to community. They had done memorials and ceremonies at places like Sandy Lake, where over 300 Ojibwe had lost their lives when they were relocated to that area to pick up treaty annuities. And they continued to do work with their communities to ensure that their young people were having a rich understanding of both Anishinaabe law alongside an understanding of U.S. law, because we do have a lot of attorneys. And interestingly, many of the leaders who had brought forward those early cases with Lakudere in Wisconsin and Mille Lacs, their children would all go on to become attorneys and continue that fight today, but again through an animation of both U.S. and Anishinaabe law. So when I was in school, I, again, was then really interested in thinking about, that if the canons of treaty interpretation assert that we must interpret treaties as the signatories understood them at the time of their signing, then like all would be okay, as long as we just understood what Ojibwe people and other Indigenous peoples intended in our treaties. So I had a lot of hope. I was very hopeful that like if we could just get that right. And so I was really interested in understanding what it was that we as Anishinaabe had intended when we negotiated our treaties, and found myself reading and going through the negotiation records of 52 treaties between Anishinaabe, the United States, and Canada. And something that consistently came up time and again in these negotiations would be Anishinaabe leaders talking about their relationship to the Creator, continually asserting that the Creator had placed them here on this earth, at times making it very clear to treaty commissioners that they understood the Creator had placed them across the big sea, so as not to be confused about origin, and often then spoke of the land as an inheritance. And so over a span of 100 years and across the territories from covering Manitoba, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Dakota, and Ontario, there was this consistent assertion about the Creator. So I really wanted to think about, what does that mean that we kept invoking the Creator? What were we doing by bringing the Creator into our treaty relationships? And so I was, again, thinking about this alongside thinking about sovereignty. Was the Creator the kind of animating source of our political authority? Is this why we kept thinking about and talking about the land as an inheritance from the Creator? And so, we have this concept in Anishinaabe we'll say, like the word for sovereignty is Eje Ogamawatazid, which, when you break that down, so John's talked about this and has broken it down, I think referencing Mary Black, where she'll say that Ogama, like that just means chief, like Ogama is a chief. But one of the definitions that John has talked about is that a chief or Ogama means to be responsible, right? To be responsible to your people. So in that way, Eje Ogama Watazid would mean to act in a way that accounts for your responsibilities to others. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about sovereignty. I'm on board with that. I was like, yep, I can get behind this. Again, thinking about the importance of relationship. But I actually think that at its core, when we think about this term sovereignty, what the Anishinaabe word for sovereignty is, I often argue that our word for sovereignty is Anishinaabe. That who we are, the core of our very creation, is what animates how we move in this place and how we relate to one another and to creation. And so that word Anishinaabe, what we call ourselves, translates, some people say, to the original people. But there's actually a number of stories that are embedded in that term. So for example, Eddie Benton Benet, Medewan leader from Lukudere, has argued that Anishinaabe means from whence the male of the species was lowered. We might dispute the male part, but right. But really, what he's talking about is this moment in which we were standing by the side of the Creator and were brought down onto the earth, and specifically Nanabuju are the first, our trickster. Others have referred to Anishinaabe as meaning the pitiful people. Sometimes we'll say it means the humble people, and then we'll tell you that we're super humble, because we are. And then we'll talk about it as the pitiful people. And this is largely, I think, spoken about as a way to talk about both the fact that we're the only part of creation who is here who does not understand our purpose. So when Tolly was talking about the importance of dreaming, right? For Anishinaabe, as George Nelson was recording, for us, those vision quests or dreaming practices are so crucial because it's how we find our purpose, right? So our point in being here is to actually get to the other side, right? That is our aspiration. And we do that through achieving a recognition or understanding of our purpose and then living that out. And so some will say that we're pitiful because we're the only part of creation who does not already know how we fit into that network or what our purpose is. So it's what we have to seek. And then some people will sometimes think of that as because we're the last of creation to have been placed here. So when we talk about our creation, we understand that the Creator had a vision. That vision was put forward and came into being, that then, the rock, started with rock, and these are why these become very important elements in our ceremonies, but rock and water and the plants and the animals. And so humans were the last to be placed on this earth. And it wasn't about understanding ourselves as pitiful because we have some belief in a hierarchy or a supremacy, but instead that people would speak about themselves as the last of creation as a way to acknowledge that when we came to this place, we were already entangled in a relationship and governing authority that came before us. that those animals, that the land as animate, as a living being, had political authority and continues to have political authority over us and how we can behave. So my ability to behave a certain way isn't just regulated here in this place because I'm outside of my own homelands, but even in my homelands, how I move through Anishinaabe territory is always conditioned and governed by those beings who came before us. So for Anishinaabe, another meaning of this word Anishinaabe, some people say, means the second people, coming from our word Nij. So Nij is two and Abe is person. So we think of ourselves also as the second people because of this time in which we were failing to live in good relationship with our relatives, with creation. And as a result had created a great imbalance and ultimately flooded the earth. And so when the earth had flooded and Nanabushu and the animals were floating on the log, those animals actually stood up for us and petitioned to the Creator that He give us another chance. And they promised that they would teach us how to live in this place. And for many Anishinaabe, that is one of the origin stories we have of our clan system, which becomes an important governing structure for us, where those animals stood up and said they would teach us how to live here. So I think that as Anishinaabe were invoking the Creator when they were negotiating their treaties with the United States and Canada, they were doing two very important things. One, they were recognizing that their own sovereignty or political authority was always conditioned and in relationship with those who came before them, so that the earth is really the ultimate sovereign, if you will, the ultimate decision maker. And in that, recognize that they had an important role in giving voice to creation, right? That we have to give voice to creation, to the land, to make sure that we're listening to the land, that we're accounting for their authority, for the authority of those animals, and so on. And there's a number of important ways we do that I'll talk about next. And the second thing I think they were doing was speaking to creation. So first, speaking for creation, and then second, speaking to creation, saying that now we will stand up for these new people who have come into our place, and that we vow to teach them how to live here, so that they too would be conditioned by those governing structures that shape how we understand how we can move through our own place. And so in thinking about the role of the sacred, I'm constantly reminded that Anishinaabe law, Indigenous law, where the laws of the place that we're on are crucial for all of us to understand, because in many ways those laws can help us to understand the ultimate authority of the land and animals that gets brought to life and brought forward and given voice through Indigenous legal traditions that generate out of these important places. So I just want to give a few examples of that. I'm not sure I'm doing per time. Great. I have no time left, really. So a few examples of that is like for Anishinaabe, as we engage in like practices like harvesting wild rice, we've developed tribal regulations that encourage ricers to move through the rice beds following particular patterns to like mitigate the impacts that they have on the actual rice beds. They're required to use cedar to make knockers because the lightweight wood has like a less impact on the rice stalks. Anishinaabe continue to animate Indigenous law by offering their tobacco before they go out on the water or go out hunting. But also, more importantly, I think the way we see some of this happening, I saw really come to life with the Zagame First Nation, who, in the midst of trying to find ways out of the Indian Act, had these huge community forums where they tried to create all kinds of space for their people to come together. And they would open and have those forums completely directed by ceremony, But they would also, they kept thinking of it as like, okay, we're going to take a break on this governance work because we have to do this healing ceremony for someone who just lost a small child. We're going to do this wiping away of the tears ceremony. Okay, we're going to take this break because now we're going to name this person because this person's been waiting for that. We were like, this is amazing. This is governance, right? And they kept saying, well, for us, the most important thing is we don't want to leave our own people behind. And I was so moved by how much for them, like, governance was about making sure that we were creating the space so that our own would understand our legal traditions and our practices so they could be lived in every moment of our days and our lives. And that they understood that process would direct all of that, so that we couldn't use processes outside of Anishinaabe law if we were trying to animate Anishinaabe law. We had to look to Anishinaabe law to actually create that space. And then I think in my final point, both with work with Sagame and with the law camps that I've been able to do some work with John with, I've just been so impressed by how important it is that we make space for young people to bring forward new kinds of questions. So we found in both of those kinds of works that young people would bring forward especially lots of important questions around gender and gender roles and sexuality that forced us to have to really think through our own teachings and traditions and how we apply them to contemporary context. So I think in closing that it's really important that we continue to make space for our young people to dream new ways forward for our people by ensuring that we're both giving them our Indigenous laws, but also giving them the space to challenge and reshape those laws to meet the conditions of their generation.
Well, I'd like to thank each of our speakers for those profound intersecting stories that told different aspects of our history. At this time, it's our time, so please line up for questions at the microphone, and we have about half an hour for discussion before lunchtime. So I hope you'll seize this opportunity.
Hello, thank you. I guess I'll begin by acknowledging the Lekwungen-speaking people whose territories we're on, and just how grateful I am to be a law student here at the University of Victoria. My name is Clay Gray, third-year law student, and my question is actually for the historians at the table, particularly Dr. Horton, thinking about how you emphasize the importance of the information and statements that were gathered by the TRC. How can we create space and open space or hold space for statements that were gathered throughout the individual assessment process, considering there were 6,000 statements gathered by the TRC, but almost or 30,000 statements gathered by the individual assessment process, but that they've now been slated to be destroyed. So how can we, or what mechanisms exist, or what mechanisms can we bring into existence to protect those stories that want to be protected and respect those that don't want to be protected or don't want to be preserved?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to pull Tali in on this too, because I know he worked on the TRC research directly. My understanding in terms of a formal decision that's come down on that is that that sets certain parameters in terms of what access is going to be allowed, what's going to be destroyed. And I think it's that question of consent as much as possible, that these are individual stories that while we do have a collective responsibility to engage with this in terms of the individual stories that people chose to share, that's their kind of choice in terms of whether and how ultimate access comes down to that. So I'm afraid I don't think I have any concrete kinds of suggestions in terms of mechanisms and what that process is going to look like. I know folks at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation are engaging with that question deeply, and yeah, I bounce it to Tali. I don't know if you have...
I really have nothing to add to that answer.
Yeah.
Consent is a big issue. I mean, I use some of those as a researcher, but I was strictly told to use them with discretion, and I couldn't use the names of the person in my final report, for example. So they've been very sensitive as a commission throughout to recognize what the wishes are of the person giving the statement. And so I think that that's all we can do. I think, and the other part of my answer would be the National Center is the archivists. There's a lot of interesting archival work being done on the records that is thinking about archives, thinking about these particular kinds of archives. There's actually quite a lot of interesting research being done, and those are the sorts of questions they're probably looking at. I'll just add, though, there's lots of great testimony to watch that is not under restriction. And you know, when I was doing research, I watched hours and hours and hours. It was painful, often very, very, very painful. I didn't share the story that really broke my heart. There was this one story which I sometimes show to students, but I've decided it's almost too difficult to show to students now. But you know, you can watch those stories and show them to anyone who thinks residential schools was not a problem. They're amazing, and the people who tell the stories are amazing, and watching it is transformative for someone who isn't perhaps aware of those histories.
Rod Nobel, old white European male, speak on those limitations. I want to thank the panel very much. I want to pick up on something which seems to me a real problem as one grapples with this question of reconciliation. Learning with respect, learning from Indigenous practices and Indigenous culture. It was suggested that not all knowledge is for all to know. We have the question of individual stories, we have the question of clan stories, we have the question of community understanding and community traditions. The question was raised earlier, I guess, how one learns from stories, learns from Indigenous wisdom, without falling into cultural appropriation or misuse of the knowledge. It's a very difficult challenge, particularly it seems to me around the university, where the balance is just hard to find.
I have lots of answers.
Okay, you try.
Okay, I'll go first.
Just pull the microphone in.
It's a great question, and I think one that a lot of people really grapple with. And I think the first step in finding answers to that question is recognizing that the places that we're on are governed by authorities other than ourselves, right? Like denaturalizing this idea that this is somehow our place, or that we, and whoever the we is here is complicated, right? But that we're always in relationship with creation and with others that can shape how we move through place. So I was thinking about this yesterday, was getting into a kind of discussion around like what it means for people to identify as a settler versus identifying as Indigenous. And someone had brought up this question about how they felt much more comfortable like seeing themselves as a guest and settler here because this was a place they had not grown up, right? And so anyway, the debate led to this discussion where, you know, I'd said, that's so interesting that like you see identifying yourself as a settler as like destabilizing your authority. Because when we acknowledge ourselves as Indigenous, it's not an assertion of authority, right? But I think that is like a misinterpretation of like the work we're doing when we begin with our acknowledgements, right? That it's about, it's like a citational practice in many ways of saying, these are the people that have taught me, this is the knowledge that I come from, these are, like, this is my, like you had said, this is the position I speak from, right? But I think sometimes that gets understood by people as though one person, or like that one group has authority and others don't, instead of actually understanding that all of us are in really complex relationships that are always conditioned by our responsibilities to others. And so I think a way to get at then how we can move through space respectfully or move through creation respectfully is to develop those relationships where we just acknowledge straight away that we are on somebody else's space and place, and that them having hundreds of years of relationship with this place, you know, we can reach out to them. I know that sounds abstract, but I think it is something actually as simple as, like, when you get into your boat, you give thought to the fact that that is not your, like, you do not have authority over that waterway, right? And that might make you think differently about how you behave in that place. And then taking that further by speaking with people who might have richer understandings about how you can better respect and acknowledge those who have that authority over the waterways and so on. So I do think it's like, can start with those little steps that can help us to build relationships. Because I can't speak for all communities, but I think within Anishinaabe communities, like in a lot of our communities anyway, we bring in lots of people, and it's not about like who is and isn't Indigenous. It's about like what our relationships are to one another and how we move through place together, right? Like we've always understand this as this world is really precarious and difficult to live in, right? And so whether we were making relationships with Haudenosaunee or Dakota or Cree or making relationships with settlers, it was all about expanding those relationships so we could draw on them in important times of need. I don't know if you guys want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, that was beautiful and given me much food for thought there. Just on the theme of relationship again too, in terms of how to not appropriate, you know, in terms of my own practice and teaching practice, it's building those relationships and activating those relationships in the context of the classroom. So people and communities with whom I have that relationship and it feels appropriate to bring into that space and to share that kind of perspective. And modeling for my students, an effort to, anyway, I won't claim to necessarily be doing so, but an effort to model that kind of vulnerability and learning in terms of where I'm at with my process too is something that I'm really trying to incorporate, and very sensitive to tremendous pressures on community and individual knowledge holders' time in this growing age of awareness and interest. So there's always that kind of tension to be aware of as well, and to kind of walk that informs how I try to go about things.
I would basically echo what Chelsea said, but I would say I'm further behind on the spectrum from where she is. She and I edited a book together, and during the process it became clear that I was much more traditional archival historian. Chelsea was well, she also works in the 20th century, so she tends to be more on the land, doing work with communities and doing oral histories. That wasn't a disparaging remark. But my point is, I've learned from her a lot of the methodologies, not so much the findings, I guess, but I've learned from her around methodologies, and so in fact, I am trying to incorporate those into my work, even though I'm working on an older time period. I can still work with those sorts of approaches, but again, like Chelsea has said, recognizing the complexity of those interactions and being sensitive to all the complexity around dealing with that. But as a historian, what I want to do, I guess, is join together the archives and the oral or the keeper's knowledge, and maybe not join them together, but to sort of look at what happens when you see a story from a different perspective.
Please.
I just want to say this is, I'm not an academic. I work for the government. I was invited by a co-op student who's working with us, and I think this is brilliant. It's a brilliant setup. But it's making me think about my religion as Hinduism and others in my boat. Like, I was treated differently growing up. When I grew up, I had many Indigenous friends, but I didn't think of them as Indigenous. They were just my friends. We are of the same color, and so we just got along. But one of my first incidents of racism was with an Indigenous group, right? I got called Paki. I got called Hindu. and it was from those Indigenous folks. And so I'm like, well, hold on a second, I'm completely confused here now. Like, where do I go? Who do I bond with? So I have a plan and I talked to, I'm gonna put you on the spot here, Chief. I've talked to the Chief as well, and I'd like to kind of bridge the divide of our community with the Indigenous communities, looking at supports for new immigrants coming in, ESL language training, foundational skills training. So when you come, you can learn about the Indigenous community, but also as a new immigrant, if you see another Indigenous individual, you're like, wow, that's just a positive light, someone who's helped me. So that will help bridge the divide. But I'm going to struggle because it's going to be very difficult to get those of us who struggled in our own life to care so much about someone else's struggle. So I worry that I try to do this, and it's just not going to go anywhere, because my mom, for example, forced marriage, came here at 8 years old, difficult upbringing. My father just saw deaths of Pakistani Hindus in India. Like, this is real. These struggles are real. I'm firstborn Canadian, or am I Indian, or am I Indo-Canadian? Who knows, right? My wife's Sikh. I speak Punjabi. I'm Hindu. My daughters struggle with what they're going to be. So I know there's these struggles, but I have my own struggles too. So I don't know if anyone has looked into this. And again, commend the Baha'i community for doing this. This is something that we will do. My father's the president of the Victoria Hindu Temple, so we will be moving towards this reconciliation in our own life. But I don't know if you're aware of this happening in other forums. Any research I could look to, so we can learn, so we can have a fruitful conversation.
Okay, one concrete example I was just going to alert you to, which you may well be aware of, but there was a series of publications produced through the work of the TRC, and one of them, I believe the title of the volume is Reconciling Canada, and was really engaging with perspectives of settler folk, or engaging with that complicated umbrella of settler identification, and folks from a variety of different perspectives, not necessarily all white. So that might be a useful, just existing resource in terms of some reading material. I just wanted to inject into this because I think it speaks to the kind of initiative that you're talking about too. Initiatives that are underway in terms of revising the citizenship tests and requirements, in terms of increasing context around the history of colonialism and the treaty piece too, and that treaty relationship, that's something that new immigrants ought to be learning about from the get-go. So kind of reconciling, decolonizing that framework as well. There's definitely work underway there too. Yeah.
I think it was right here.
Please go ahead.
I just want to add to what you were saying, because I've been thinking all the time as this goes on about my own situation. I'm originally from Chile, and I've been very immersed in the immigrant experience in Canada, that my work has focused very strongly on that. And the interesting thing is that through focusing on the immigrant experience here, I have started to understand the experience of First Nations or Indigenous people in Chile, and how extraordinary it has been, and also, in a way, how the worldview of at least one of the very important Indigenous people in Chile, the Mapuche, how extraordinarily similar it is to what is happening here, and how their life is evolving now in Chile, and also my own responsibility to them, in terms of the things that I ignored. I actually studied history at university in Chile, history and geography, and when I finished 4 years of study, my ignorance about the indigenous people in Chile was abysmal, abysmal, 4 years, and I didn't learn anything in university in those days. I hope that they're doing better now, because of all those, the same pattern that we see here. So anyway, I also just wanted to tell you about the huge importance that what you're doing now here has for the rest of South America. I don't want to. I only wanted to speak about South America, which is what I know a little bit about, because the issues there are so strong and so. I mean, the situation is so horrible. And so on. So whatever things happen here will have a great importance also for there. So remember that. Thank you.
Well, and I will just say that I think like what has been brought up by both of the last two questions is that there is for many people, if not really for all of us in the room, a shared kind of relationship to colonialism, right? That has enabled so many of us to be dispossessed from our places, because really we are all immigrants here except the Huisadich, Esquimalt, and Songhees people, right? So all of us are moving, and I'm sure their relationships as well are complicatedly conditioned by the experiences of colonialism and dispossession, right? And so I think that's where we can be attentive to what kinds of shared experiences we have instead of being constantly pitted against each other, which is what often happens. That leads to kind of interracial tensions, right? So I just say that to say, I still think that Indigenous law has so much to actually offer in way of responses here. Like, what would an immigration policy look like that was developed out of local Indigenous laws, right, and traditions? I mean, like, instead of turning to Canada to give us the answers in the way of like citizenship tests and so on, what do our own legal traditions say about how we determine who can and cannot access our spaces? So.
Yeah, Troy Hunter again. Lots of interesting discussion here, very important. One of the things that I think about is that with the First Nations, we have the teachings of the medicine wheel. It's a circle and the four directions, just like this is four directions here. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the Bahá'í is somewhat in that way as well. And all around the world, there's very many teachings that places, sacred places that use the four directions, cardinal directions or whatnot, as a means of coming together, or religion or practice or whatnot. The point that I wanted to make is that in our way, we have the red, yellow, white, black, and that represents the four races of human beings. And together, it makes a circle. And together, that's who we are as human beings. So in the Lakota, they call Matakiwas. It means we're all related. And so that's kind of, it brings it back to, but how do we reconcile the stuff you're talking about with the Christianity and Indigenous ways of practice or knowing? These are the kinds of things that we all need to work on, because if we don't, we have more war and more problem in this world. And so what we need is a peaceful way, reconciliation. I think that's the heart of what reconciliation is about, is how do we work together? How do we live together? And there's a teaching that I love very much, and it's I think it's the words of Jesus that said, "There are many rooms in my Father's house." And that's the way I like to see things, is that when our purpose as spiritual beings is to get through and to cross the bridge, but build no home upon it, we must cross over to the other side. And that when we get there to the other side, as spirits, there's a place for us to go, whatever it is our way of practice. My great-grandmother was a full-blooded Tunaka, and she was a devout Catholic. The first time she passed away and came back, my mom came to her and said, "What did you see when you went over there?" She said she was walking on the left-hand side is all the people, the Tunacha that she knew, praying in the Catholic way. And on the right-hand side, all the Tunacha that she knew, praying in the Tunacha way. And so that sort of, it strengthens my belief that there are many rooms in my Father's house. So if we could all just get along and reconcile. So I just want to say that.
My name is Nathaniel Williams, Cowichan Tribes. One's here with me, Sabrina Williams. Her grandmother is Tiny Williams. My father's name is Gregory Wickenbill. He's German, half British. He immigrated from Germany. And I guess I just wanted to share a few things. I remember from the last panel, two women asked a question about addiction and spirit sickness and art and appropriation. And I just wanted to share that I think my personal belief, it's not my place or within my power to say what belongs to anybody. I believe that culture and spirituality is a fundamental part of society, and that it belongs to everybody and it should be shared with everybody. Sundance Chief Melvin Graybeer once said, doesn't belong, this culture and this spirituality doesn't belong to one tribe and it doesn't belong to one people. It should be shared with the world and it should be shared with everybody. So with regards to appropriation and art, I think my sister's an artist and she went to university for art and now she's in Emily Carr. So for her, I think it's easy because she won't have that problem where it's like, oh, well, you're not native, so like, if you do that art or practice it, it's suddenly appropriating it. So I think it's tricky. I think as an artist, you take risks, and sometimes you have to pay attention and realize what you're doing and what you're following. But I don't believe that you shouldn't. Like, I believe if you have a passion and you want to create and you want to follow that art, I think you should. And I think that it's important. And with regards to spirit sickness, I guess I could share personally, the hardest thing I've had to do in my life, when I was growing up, I turned my back on my culture. I turned my back on spirituality. The path of addiction is an easy one. It's so easy to go down the street, to go to the liquor store, to find drugs. It's so easy. And I know personally, I have lots of friends, and some of them don't have access. Like, I'm really lucky my mom's a social worker, so she's always trying to include me in community. And I can tell you that with spirit sickness and going through addiction and struggles, the best thing is not to, best thing isn't to segregate someone or push them away. The best thing you can do is to bring them closer and love them and show them the way. And so I just feel really sad because I've lost a few friends, and it's like, what's different for me to them that, like, you know, I had certain access to things, but they didn't. So just because they have different skin colors or they're from, you know, different religions or cultures. And that's what really bothers me too, is I remember growing up in high school and having certain friend groups, and the thing that bothered me most is how it turns into cliques, and it's like certain things are said where it's like, oh yeah, like, that's what really I agree with, is like, the man he said about like being Indian and stuff. So it's like suddenly you have your friends saying certain things. Oh, you get cheaper liquor, you got a status card, you get free gas, or like, you know, cheaper gas. And it's like, that's just the way it is. That's the way it's come about. And it's like, yeah, sure, it's great, but it still doesn't also make me feel like I'm on a higher or lower level than anybody else. It's just like, you know, it's the way it is, and it's part of the governments, and it's part of the system as it is. So I just feel the hardest thing to do. Yeah, I feel like I've lost, the hardest thing I've had to do is to regain trust and regain faith in leaders, and knowing which ones are for the people and not just, you know, doing things because they can out of the sake of power and their role in the society.
couple of comments. I don't know if any of the panelists want to share anything before we go on to the next.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Yes, go.
So my name is Thomas Lovekin-Evron. I'm from Northern Alberta, Cree Territory, Miguel. Thanking the facility for allowing me to be here. My question is pretty straightforward. So my mother, she's Cree. She went to residential school her whole life. My father, he's Jewish, and I was growing up with a strong awareness of the Shoah. I still speak at the Shoah events and try to never forget the Holocaust. They didn't even know I was Jewish. They invited me as an Indigenous law student here. Speaking of Indigenous law students, but also, actually, the other half, too. Been struggling to survive, So when you're raised in that environment, my mom and my dad both raised me with big awareness that you need love. You always need love. You should never forget love. But you should also never forget what happened. So, being raised Jewish, you're always aware that the Holocaust is just behind you. And so when you're raised now Cree and with residential school in the north and everywhere in Canada, you're also raised this is just behind you. And so to not forget love, but to never forget. So I guess my question is, what do you guys think of removing of statues and the removing of objects that are part of the past, but are also, I don't know, I'll leave it at that. You know what I'm saying?
That's a very ongoing discussion among historians. There's a special session at this coming Canadian Historical Association meeting about that special question. And I would say, I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for the whole discipline. I'm a bit ambivalent about removing statue because I think keeping them there in a new context might be a more instructive way to never forget the history. So not keeping the statue of John A. Macdonald there without any new context, but putting new context around it to show you the whole story of John A. Macdonald and who he represented and what he did. There are other historians who would prefer we just take the statues down because they represent a colonial moment. And I understand that perspective as well. I guess I would use them as a way to teach, as opposed to obliterate them and then forget the history. Because then you get the sense that, well, now we're smarter, and now we won't make new mistakes, because those are the people in the past that made mistakes. We're better. And that's a dangerous mentality. And so that's my answer to the question.
I'll give the take them down answer then. But what this makes me think of is all of the decolonization work happening with Indigenous peoples reclaiming our place names and renaming streets is one of the ways we see that happening a lot. I have not a strong position on whether monuments or statues should stay or be taken down, but I do think they do really important work, right? Which is claiming place and claiming history and claiming particular narratives. And I think we have to think about what that means to live in a world that's so completely saturated with one particular version of that history. And maybe it is about bringing forward different narratives. But I also think a lot of it has done the work of covering. And I do think there is some real strength that can come from uncovering and allowing also Indigenous knowledge to emerge from that, right? Which is what a lot of the activities around renaming or reclaiming names is doing, right? So trying to unearth and here I'm thinking of Sarah Hunt's work, who's right at the back, right? About the ways in which the colonial scape doesn't obliterate Indigenous knowledge and relationships to land, it just covers it, right? So much of our own understandings of place and relationship with one another and history can be brought forward as well. So I do think it's also a bit of an uncovering practice.
Yeah, I'll just say, I guess, echo and share a lot of similar thoughts with both the panelists here. I think in terms of those of us from settler backgrounds and heritage, that remembering and that truth piece of this, truth and reconciliation, we still have a lot of work to do with sitting with that history. And so in those kinds of new spaces and new creations, there may be a way to narrate that in as well, or just ensuring that, I think that notion of teachable moment is a fruitful one, that in that resetting, it's also remembering.
Can I add one thing? Yeah, I just want to add, to pick up on what Chelsea said. I think the last panelist, we talked about the settler Canada being sick. And this isn't a cure for the sickness by putting new statues or rethinking about statues, but it's one way to try to teach the majority of Canadians, white Canadians, who have no interest in reconciliation, and let me tell you, there are many. That's one small way to engage that perspective.
We have one final question, and then we'll close for lunch.
I was just going to say, it's related to just about every question or every comment that's been made just recently. One is, when you take delivery of these amazing pieces of truth that people have experienced and lived through, there's still a segment of the population who will deny that. In the same way, the segment of the population who will deny that the Holocaust happened. I was listening to this amazing talk recently that said there's a book called The Unpersuaded. I think that's the name of it. That really, it is part of our nature to believe that we're right. And we have to struggle against that. Because, and he was saying in this talk, he was saying, well, yeah, he said, well, there much was given to indicate that we really do believe we're right. So he said, well, I thought I'd try it out. So I went through different, conclusions that I had drawn. And he thought of one, he goes, well, I think I'm right there. And then he thought of another, and he goes, yeah, pretty much on track there. And then another one, yeah. So it really, you come to that conclusion that, my goodness, we do think that we're right. If you couple that with this denial, the unpersuaded are people who, no matter what evidence, no matter what story the relatives are sharing, they're unpersuaded, and these are closed. So the ability, I think, I'm waiting to hear, and maybe there already is a doctorate given on listening, but there should be. I remember I was traveling with my grandmother, who, and when she was a little girl, danced for Sitting Bull. That was her age. But she liked to go, and she loved religion. She would go to place to place to place. And when, of course, this was a Bahá'í gathering at the Peace Arch near your territory, very near, like a few miles away. So she's from Standing Rock, so we went over there, and they asked her to say something, and she went, me? Because there's that humility, So she says, I noticed that some of you came by car, and some of you might have even walked over here to this gathering, and some of you use this mode and that mode. But we all got here, didn't we? And so I guess how I want to just tie all those points together is, I think, dear relatives, we do need to be very concerned about our relatives who believe that they will not be persuaded. They will not be persuaded about what they think or what they see or what they hear, but only by what they've concluded. So for us to really, really be totally immersed in a learning environment, one in which we're going to be so open to listen to each other. There's a quotation in the Bahá'í writings that say, believing that you're right and everyone else is wrong is the surest obstacle in the path of unity. Well, that's the truth.
Well, I'd like to thank, on all of our behalf, the panelists for their generous remarks today, for sharing their knowledge with us. And I'd also like to thank all of you for your thoughtful questions and the way in which you're also participating in this conversation. So with that, we'll conclude the session this morning. I actually don't know what the arrangements are for lunch, but I assume if you walk through that door, you're going to find out. And you can trust 100 or so hungry people to find the food. So I'll leave that in your hands. We'll be back here at 1:30 in the same place. Thank you.